Greetings, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, and welcome to this week's. There we go. Okay. Greetings, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, and welcome to this week's edition of Botany Book Club. Today, as you can see over yonder here, we're talking about chapters, or essays, 13 to 17 of Gathering Moss. So, let's just jump into it. I hope everyone is doing well. Okay, 1 second. There we go. Okay. OBS was once again being weird. Yeah. Hopefully everyone is doing well, having a good day. Hope that the last few days have been good for you. But let's get started in this. So, for this, if you're following along with the text itself instead of the audio, it's a landscape of chance. What's it? Landscape of chance, city of mosses, the web of reciprocity, indigenous uses of moss, the red sneaker, and portrait of Sphagnum. Sphagnum. Speculum is something different. Sphagnum, yeah. Okay. So alright. Are there any? Alright, so there are a few illustrations in Landscape of Chance. Yeah. So, let's see. So, for the first one, we've got, the essay opens with a recounting of a large storm and how the kind of chance nature of natural phenomena kind of impacts how plants propagate and how different components in the natural sphere interact, kind of. Specifically in context of mosses, how mosses propagate. How mosses propagate. And at one point they're doing an experiment to determine how the mosses that are being studied find new locations and end up where they end up, because mosses tend to be largely stationary, or if not stationary, then like have a relatively small range of dispersion depending on the species and what strategies have been put in place by the moss to spread across the environment. And there's a discussion about how slugs were seen in the environment and tended to be going through moss patches, and that they might be a potential disperser. Which they might well be, and there's likely some dispersion that could be connected to slugs and other mollusks migrating through the area. But when they actually did experiments to see if that was like a reasonable hypothesis, that would be attributed, like all the or at least most of the dispersion of a particular moss, which I believe it was the Cranum flagare. So this one right here. And for this particular one, we've got both the sporophyte and asexual brood branches. So we've got the sporophyte as the spike, and then the asexual brood branches, which are down here. Okay. Yeah. Alright. So, essentially, in order to figure out what was dispersing the spores of the flagare into the habitat, having seen slugs go through the area, they set up a like a test station, sort of, so that the slugs and snails and whatever other moss could just kind of slide across it, or well, not slide so much, like crawl, I suppose, crawl across it, and then they would analyze the slime trails left behind, and found that there were some spores in the slime trails. So it's reasonable to conclude that at least some of the dispersion could be attributed to that. However, there wasn't enough to like say definitively whether that was what was causing it. So they set up another experiment, and essentially, like, there was a bunch of moss, and made sure that there were a number of slugs, and probably snails too, really, but a number of mollusks in the vicinity of the section of moss that was being studied, and noticed that once they were in there, they just kind of sat and had a munch on some moss and didn't really feel the need to go anywhere else. And discovered that instead of the slugs being the primary depositor, it was chipmunks that happened to be going through the area, because the chipmunks preferred transit path was in line with turn the phone down there, was in line with where the moss tends to grow. And at this point, for that particular one, it was just on top of logs, not like under them or whatnot. And it works for the particular species involved. Yeah. And then moving on to the next one, we've got city mosses. So essentially, the main theme for this particular essay is that there's a lot of niche environments found in cities that don't exist, or at least don't exist with much frequency, out in uninterrupted habitats, or less disturbed habitats, I suppose. Like the giant limestone buildings that, aside from areas that have natural limestone cliffs and things, you don't tend to see that sort of structure outside of large urban developments. But even so, if you look at most statues and architecture, grave markers, that especially those with engraved components, any place that there's moisture allowed to gather, generally like in the text of a grave marker or in the folds of a marble statue's clothing or what have you, there tends to be moss growing. And because it is kind of a highly specialized environment at that point, there's some species that only grow in those conditions or have adapted over time to grow in a specific condition only found in a particular city's climate or with a particular arrangement of pollutants that are around it, even. Because ecological niches are a thing. There's some that traditionally only grow along coastlines in conjunction with seabird nesting sites because they grow on and around excrement. So, like, gold guano and things like that. But in a city context, the equivalent would tend to be pigeons. So, on ledges and things where pigeons like to roost a lot, that's their preferred habitat. So you end up with a little mossy layer that would provide a nice amount of bedding. It's nice and cozy and things, but also it feeds off the waste products from the birds, and along with like other animals. In that particular, there's the argentium that kind of thrives in nitrogen-rich environments. So, like the entrance to a burrow, for example, because a lot of animals will either have, like, especially for burrowing animals, a lot of animals will either have a designated room in the burrow, or will just go out to the entrance of the burrow to do the business and then go back inside. Most of the time, if they're going out of the burrow, it's to mark their territory and ward off predators or others of that species, to say, like, hey, this place is occupied, you'll find somewhere else. So, there's that. And then we've got an example of the shoot and sporophyte of Bryum argentum, which, so we've got where's it? The sporophyte up here. Which gets its name because it's kind of a silvery sort of plant. It has a kind of silver sheen to it. Yeah. And yeah, it is interesting though. I had not ever heard the term Ariel Plankton before this, but what she's describing is essentially like small, like minute components that just kind of float along sometimes. And Bryum spores are a constant component of Ariel Plankton, the cloud of spores and pollen which circulates around the globe. So, essentially, if there's enough of like a wind current, it can leave whatever the home range is and find another one. Especially because spores tend to be relatively stable and tend to also be relatively able to find new purchase somewhere. So there's that. Okay, so we've got the shoot and the sporophyte here, and then we've got the leaves over here. There it is. So yeah, for that particular species though, aerial dispersal is a thing. It's a lot more common to have dispersal via footsteps, just because with most mosses they're pretty low to the ground, and if you're walking across them, then you get the spores and whatnot like on your shoes. Just like for a lot of species, if you walk through a patch of whatever it is, then it's likely that you'll get a few like stickers or whatnot gravitate into you as you're going past, just because that's how the dispersal mechanism has adapted over time. Also, I hadn't quite realized that mosses just being part of the grasscape is just very much a thing in most areas. But it is. It depends on where you are and what kind of ecology you have in a particular area as to whether or not more or less mosses would be in place somewhere. But yeah, if essentially if there's moss growing in with grasses and whatnot, they're just there filling a niche, probably because there's a gap in the grass coverage, but not every area is going to have that. I know that's never been a thing that we've had in my part of Southern California. And we make a point to not use pesticides and herbicides in gardening and stuff. But we get things like, I don't know, dandelions all the time. And like random other seeds and things all the time. But I've never seen mosses, at least in this area. If it's a wetter climate, I can totally see that. Or if it's like under the shade of a particular tree, maybe. But yeah, the only time I've really actually seen mosses actively growing just wherever was when I was in Britain. So yeah, considerably different climate than it is here. I'll say that much. But yeah, essentially, if you find moss growing in your grass, it's not trying to kill the grass. It's just there vibing. But yeah. Also, the moss retains water a lot. So if water scarcity is a thing, and you happen to have mosses in your particular area, that would probably be a positive. Oh yeah. Also, while there's some mosses that have adapted better to certain things than others, they tend to be mosses and lichens tend to be very sensitive to environmental changes, specifically air pollution. So it's kind of a first warning canary in a coal mine situation when it comes to that. And as previously stated, the photosynthetic properties in mosses only work when the plant is wet or is able to access a moisture-rich environment. That and in that sort of vein, the presence of Lota crispa in dime-sized domes on a tree indicates that sulfur dioxide levels are less than 0.00 parts per million, since it's highly sensitive to pollution. So, that, like, honestly, the first time I saw this, I figured it looked like there was a drawing of a fork. Not gonna lie. But that's the shoot of Alortha crispa that we've got there. Okay. So, next we've got the web of reciprocity, indigenous uses of moss. As all chapters start, we've got the fun little bryophyte up in the corner there. But yeah. And the way that she writes, there tends to be a story, a lesson, and then bringing the lesson back to the story, whatever it is. For this one, we're talking about her uncle Big Bear, who wanted to create a school in the foothills of the Sierra. Wow. Okay. Different location. Ugh. The foothills of the Sierra to make sure that people remember traditional knowledge and how to interact with nature and be able to read the landscape and read the river and catch fish and things. In addition to modern education. And yeah. So we've got the kind of mutual relationship between traditional ecological knowledge and modern science, and how that coexists in a more complete whole. And in acknowledging that traditional knowledge is both useful and like highly impactful, you have a better idea of what the whole actually is, and how the different components observed by science, by traditional practices, coexist together. And okay, here we go. And one of the things brought up is that a lot of times, the science says, this plant is growing in this particular location because the environment has changed insofar as these particular factors are now true, and so the habitat range has shifted, which is a thing, definitely. But just doing an underline because I forgot to mark something the first read through. 1 second. But in addition to that, we've got instances where the indigenous knowledge of a particular plant or plants and how they interact with the community and how they interact with the wider environment tend to indicate that if the plant is growing in a particular location, then it means that a plant is needed in that particular location, and if not right then soon, because what was the phrase? The plant's purpose can be read through its place. So like, what's it? So, it's well known that a medicinal plant frequently occurs in the vicinity of the source of the illness. So, the example that she gives in here, well, one of the examples, but one of the examples she gives in here is that if you're going through the forest and happen to encounter poison ivy, a lot of times jewelweed is growing not too far away. And jewelweed, if it's crushed and applied to whatever area the poison ivy has impacted, can neutralize the sting. Sometimes, like, if it's caught early enough, to the point that there's no rash that forms. And I was reminded of when I was in England, mostly just because I haven't seen burdock growing just by itself stateside, but I've seen nettle. Like, we have some nettle plants, but nettle, for all that its sting is a positive if it's intentionally applied, can be pretty painful depending on how much of your body is impacted with it at any given time. And there's times that, like, you need to not have the nettle, the only word coming to mind is venom, and that's not it. Compounds, I guess. The nettle compounds in your system at a particular point. Because, like, speaking from experience here, if you are handling a lot of nettle over an extended period of time, your hands kind of get used to the feeling and it has less of an impact. But like if you fall in it, or if like your arm just brushes up against a whole patch, it stings. It feels like a raw sunburn for a good day or so. And at least in my experience, it alternates between that kind of raw sunburn feeling and kind of a numbness, sort of. So if you need to mitigate that, if you crush up some burdock leaves and apply it to the area, like if you rub it in, then it kind of neutralizes the the sting of it. The more you know. Also, oh, okay. Alright, one second. Okay. Yeah, no, I couldn't remember the section that it had been in. But we've also got, yeah, there we go. So in addition to everything else, right, we've got instances where mosses have traditionally been used because the author was trying to figure out what traditional uses for mosses themselves were, because there's a lot of information about particular plants, and things, but mosses tend to not be included in most like general knowledge sort of things. And she found that mosses were mosses tended to be collected and used mostly by women. And because most ethnographers were men and didn't see the merit in women's botanical interactions or weren't included in women's spaces enough to know that that was a thing. Honestly, a lot of times it was the former. But because mosses have some kind of mild antibacterial properties and are highly absorbent, they were used as essentially the first disposable diapers and sanitary products. And because there's so many different types of mosses, and the mosses that are available have different properties and different softnesses and whatnot, and obviously live in different locales, it's reasonable to deduce that women have had a strong connection to mosses and a very what's the word? Complete, I guess, or involved knowledge of moss species and properties. So, yeah. So, in the example of babies, right? Packing a baby into like their cradle board so that they would be secure and safe and everything in transit and all that, and just safe and protected just as is. They were often packed into a nest of dried moss, which would do the dual purpose of being a comfy place to rest, but it's also a bed of a highly absorbent material that wicks moisture away from the skin, and because it has those antimicrobial properties and is highly absorbent, it would negate any kind of like rash from forming. And especially in the case of like sphagnum moss, because that's one of the ones that's most widely recognized, I suppose. That can absorb up to like 40 times its weight in water. So that as a sanitation aid would be highly reasonable. That, and there's some there's some research that's suggested that in, I believe it was the medieval period, that sometimes people use mosses as toilet paper because of the same reason, presumably, because it was pretty much everywhere, and a highly renewable resource. There we go. A highly renewable resource, and it absorbed everything. Also, there's a lot of discussion of how in most traditional cultures a woman's menstruation time or moon time was seen as a period of increased power, I suppose. And that's part of why, in some instances, women being like menstruating, well, one sec. Verbal wires got crossed for a second there. That would be one of the big reasons why, in certain contexts, women during that time of the month have been seen as like something to be feared, as it were, which is the case in some areas. And if not feared, then there's the I don't know, disgust element and whatnot. But part of that, it goes back to most ethnographers and anthropologists being men and seeing women off in a secluded area and interpreting that through their own lens instead of through the lens of the culture that they're observing. Also, in order to prepare certain foods, like salmon, which is highly integral to a lot of communities, moss would be wiped on the fish before it was cooked to get rid of like, toxins and slime and anything else that was there. And in order to kind of preserve the fish, that was like that was part of the like, preservation strategy, along with providing some of the steam to cook the fish and calmas. Calmas, yeah, calmas root. Yeah. And going back to Uncle Big Bear at the start of the essay, which is discussing how tobacco would be burned in the honor of the plants, and that tobacco is a bringer of knowledge. So it's kind of a a thanking of the teachers, in this case, the plant teachers. Alright. Okay, so alright. So then we've got the red sneaker, which is essentially an homage to, or a reference to a red sneaker that Robin Wall Kimmerer lost while investigating Sphagnum Moss bog a number of years ago, because she was going through the bog and the shoe got eaten by the moss, because it has a very powerful suction when anything kind of impacts the surface for an extended period of time. So now it just goes barefoot in there, because it's a lot easier to drag a foot out than it is to drag a thing on a foot out. Yeah. And for this particular one, right, we've got the theme running through the whole is kind of the reclaiming and the living surface, the living structure of the moss, and how that connects to the living the living structure of the indigenous communities that were subjected to genocide and forced relocation. And residential schools and things. And it starts the lands of my ancestors are dotted with kettle-hole bogs among the forests of the Great Lakes. The Anishinaabe people conduct their ceremonies using the water drum, a drum so sacred that it is not to be viewed by the public. Deer hide stretched across the bowl of wood filled with sacred water. The water drum signifies the heartbeat of the water, of the universe, of creation, and of the people. The wooden bowl gives honor to the plants, the deer hide honors the animals, and the water within the life of Mother Earth. The drum is bound with a hoop that represents the circle in which all things move: birth, growth, and death, the circle of the seasons, the circle of our years. And here we go. And then at the end of the chapter, she writes, I am dancing on a water drum of peat, in a country of vast blue lakes where loons are calling. Dancing, my feet sending the message of my presence in waves through the peat, and in waves of memory. They send back the message of their presence. We are still here. Like the living surface of the sphagnum, the sunlit green layer at the top of a column of dark accumulated peat, individually ephemeral, collectively enduring, we are still here. So, bracketed on both sides, that there's discussion of the sphagnum moss and how the cells absorb water, and how it's just the very outer part of the moss that is actually alive and photosynthesizing, and everything else is essentially dead cells that just provide a porous cell wall structure to absorb water and retain the water in order to sustain the plant and whatever surrounding plants and animals happen to exist. So we've got a picture of sphagnum moss here, just one individual sphagnum plant, and then there we go, and the porous cells right there, which compared to regular plant cells, that does look a bit odd, but what she's mentioning here is that only one cell in about 20 is actually alive, and the rest are dead cell walls that are just surrounding where the cell contents used to be, and are then able to be really porous and absorb water, which is why the plant can absorb like 40 times the amount of water that the size of the plant would, in theory, be able to contain. And one of the other things mentioned in here, right, is that during the Iron Age, specifically, there's a lot of there's instances where someone has been collecting peat, most often as a fuel source, and has come across human remains in the bog. And that tends to be, like, sometimes it's not, which is why, if you find human remains, you need to call in the authorities and whatnot to determine if there's any foul play involved. But if it's a peat bog, it tends to be that there was an Iron Age community not too far away, and most of the time there's evidence to suggest that remains found in bogs are the result of human sacrifice to assist with agricultural rituals, especially if there'd been a really severe drought or some kind of disease had impacted the crops or the people or whatnot. So someone was selected from the community or volunteered from the community and was then sacrificed and placed in the bog, which is how you get the bog bodies, quote unquote, and the Tolland man and the Pult Down. Yeah, those are the ones that I'm most familiar with. Also, mosses were sometimes used to stuff into boots and whatnot to increase the warm factor, which is cool. So yeah, we've got an individual sphagnum leaf right here, and the clustered branches of sphagnum. Where is it? Right here. Also, Sphagnum Moss is one of those odd ones that can actually manipulate the environment that it's in. So it one second. So it not only kind of produces a waterlogged environment where not much can actually survive, admittedly, but due to the kind of in order to make sure that it's able to survive in an area and kind of push out any competitors, in addition to making sure that it's a waterlogged, nutrient-poor environment, it changes the pH. So sphagnum moss acidifies the water that it grows in making it inhospitable for other plants. And the release of acid also makes it easier for the sphagnum to absorb what little nutrients there are for its own use. To the point that the water at the edge of a bog might have a pH of 4.3, which is essentially the equivalent of a diluted vinegar, which is also, incidentally, why there's so many instances of remains and otherwise easily degradable materials found in bogs, because it's not an oxygen-rich environment. Everything's kind of contained. Oh yeah. Also, in addition to the mosses or the peat areas being harvested for fuel and whatnot, traditionally people who lived on the boggy taiga plains used it to refrigerate meat, because it can be like 50 degrees cooler under the moss layer than it is on the surface. Also, just like with other stratigraphic materials and ice and things, if there's something that layers over time and you're able to take a cross section of that, you can see what materials were extant at a particular point. So, paleoecologists can take a cylinder of material and see what kind of plant material and pollen and other debris were present at a particular point. Enabling them to have a physical calendar of the location's history and be able to trace back particular things to before anything was been actively recorded for the area, which you get like paleoecology, paleoethnobotany, that sort of thing out of that practice. There we go. Yeah. Yeah. Alright. So the last one for today. We've got Portrait of Sphagnum. Okay. 1 second. We're gonna take a short stretch break. also water, because water is life. And I figure, the mosses would want everyone to be hydrated, so there you go. PSA from the mosses, drink some water. There we go. And back. Sphagnum. Okay. So first I've got a sphagnum leaf right here. Kinda reminds me of dandelion a little bit. And this particular one, like, depending on the species, it follows a different species. Which, just means, Sphagnum, what was it? Sphagnum ampullaceum inhabits the droppings of the white-tailed deer, just like Sphagnum luteum would inhabit the droppings of a wolf or coyote. And it's enough of a distinct thing that it's not that there are droppings, so therefore there is moss. It's there are droppings during these set of particular situations, and a particular type of fly has landed on the droppings and is laying their eggs there. And because the flies have been to other patches where there are other droppings, that there is also moss, the spores from those mosses are now transported to the new location, and because the spores have a spot with like nutrients because of the droppings, they can now form another little colony of moss, and then the whole cycle repeats. Yeah. And then we've got where are you? There we go. We've got the Sphagnum Moss. There you are. Sphagnum there. With the leaves and then the sporophyte body up here. And because there's such a limited ecosystem, I suppose, for a particular moss clump, they have to go from trying to establish a new colony to reproduction and sending spores off to create a new colony altogether in the span of just a couple of weeks. because otherwise it would just mean extinction at that point. Yeah. And in order to, because the spores are only distributed to piles of droppings, and because they need to be distributed by flies, because flies are the only ones going to other piles of droppings, they display, like, quote unquote unmossly shades like pink and yellow, because that's a color scheme that attracts the flies, because otherwise it would be a matter of trying to toss the spores up in the wind and hope that they landed on something that was hospitable. But because they have such a distinctive range that they need, that's not exactly possible. So the spores are kind of a sticky, or they have a sticky coating so that they actually stick to the flies, and then as the flies migrate to another patch to do their thing, they deposit the spores. Yeah. So that's it for that. Yeah. With that being said, ow. You ever have those times when you just stab yourself in the chin with the thing that you're using as a bookmark because you forgot that it was sticking up out of the book? Has that just happened? That's there we go. Well, yeah, we'll do that. Anyone have any particular comments, observances, whatnot, when it comes to the moss or the book or any other shenanigans? Oh. That's the end of the notes that I've got for this round. Yeah. Alright. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So for next week, and if you're not familiar, we usually do book club on Mondays, but there were some extenuating circumstances yesterday, so that didn't really happen. But Mondays 4 p.m. PST tends to be book club time, unless otherwise stated in the Discord, which we've got. And yeah, so next week is going to be finishing the book. If you're listening to the audio, it'd be, how many chapters in? 18 to 21. If you're reading the physical text, it's the owner that starts at page 125 to the end. So there's that. And then I believe we're doing Orwell's Roses after that. I believe that's the name. So, yeah. It'll be another couple of weeks before we dive into that. It's another nonfiction. But to give y'all a heads up on that one. Yeah. That being said, if you want to check out my YouTube stuff and the podcast and whatnot, there's links there. Oh, apparently I don't have one for that. Maybe? There we go. Okay. So, with that being said, and if you're watching this on YouTube, because I will be uploading it to YouTube eventually, everything that was just linked in the chat is going to be in the description down below the video. So, with that being said, let's see if there's anyone on. Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much for hanging out and taking part in the discussion and general shenanigans happening up in these parts. I really appreciate it, and I will see you all later. Alright.